Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Noreen Sharif and I am your MC for this evening. On behalf of Nilofer and Dr. Azim Jiwani, I would like to welcome you all here tonight and to thank you for being here with us. Tonight's event is a conversation with the author of Humanizing Medicine, Making Health Tangible by Dr. Azim Jiwani. Healthcare inequity is no longer a geographical phenomenon based on the proverbial north-south divide as it has been for decades. But it's a pressing global imperative for every country in the world as we begin to understand the global interconnectedness of the phenomenon and how a small action taken in one place has a massive reaction in another. In his thought-provoking book, Humanizing Medicine, Dr. Azim Jiwani, a keen student of global healthcare inequities, highlights some of the basic issues which he has been studying now for over 50 years, in which he has been passionately engaged. Sadly, the breakthroughs we are seeing are too little and too late. This book, which Dr. David Nabarro of the World Health Organization highlighted as recommended reading for every medical student in the world, touches on some of the most fundamental reasons as to why we are seeing such glaring global inequities in the healthcare systems worldwide today. This evening, we will gain an insight into what this book aims to convey and why the time is now for this critical discussion to take place if we are not to sleepwalk into a major global health catastrophe. The author, Dr. Azim Jiwani, has worked in healthcare and global health development for several decades, holding various leadership positions in academia, hospital, and community settings. His work included teaching research, medical administration, strategic planning, and advisory roles. Dr. Jiwani held senior faculty positions with the Aga Khan University and at the University of British Columbia in the Faculty of Human Medicine as a clinical professor. He has interacted with many local, national, and international organizations, including the World Health Organizations, the United Nations universities, and global health institutions. He continues to be involved in consulting and advising in healthcare, education, and international development. In conversation with Dr. Jiwani tonight will be Dr. Mohamed Keshavjee, an international specialist on cross-cultural mediation. A lawyer by profession with a background in dispute resolution, Dr. Keshavjee is the author of 4 books, one of them a memoir on his family's diasporic history in Africa, confronting apartheid in South Africa. Dr. Keshavjee is also a scholar of diasporic movements and has written a book of short stories called Diasporic Distractions that highlights the end of the empire foibles in East Africa during the famous Wind of Change era. For his work on peace and human rights education, Dr. Keshavjee was conferred with the 2016 Gandhi King Aikido Peace Award by the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Azim Jiwani and Dr. Keshavjee. Thank you.
We're today exactly at the cusp of 50 years since the day Dr. Jiwani received his certificate at Makerere University in Uganda at the hand of President Idi Amin. I don't think he realized what this journey was going to be. I'm sure that he was, I'm not sure that he was trembling when he was given his certificate, but he was very happy, and I don't think he knew what the world was going to look like in the next 50 years. So it's a very historic year for all of us. Azim, I read your book. I couldn't put it down, to be honest. I'm not a doctor, my wife is. But I thought that it's a very interesting book in the sense that you qualified in East Africa in the 1970s at a remarkably respected institution of medical science, Makerere University. And you saw another type of world a world where diseases were different, where resource allocations were different, where age groups of people were different. And somehow you saw a difference, but you could not put your hand around it. You began to see that something wasn't straight, but there was some difference. You come back to East Africa, you qualify, and of course then you get your certificate at the hands of Idi Amin, and the rest is history. In between that time, you write a book, or you write a paper on the impact of the arms race on health. And you begin to foray a bit into the ideological Cold War that the world was involved in. And I believe that paper brought you into contact with Prince Sadruddin Aga Khan, who was very much involved in global issues through the Bellerive Foundation. And you found yourself in Geneva at some conference. The third encounter in your life is when you are practicing as a doctor in the Rockies in Alberta. And some person comes into your surgery because his wife is unwell. And you begin to encounter a global international organization whose concerns resonate with the restive feeling that you're feeling, that Canada is not your home, you're a qualified doctor, but somehow you are not fulfilling your passion in life. Somehow all these trends come together. Can you elaborate how all these dots connected for you and what brought you to Karachi out of the comfort of a Calgary medical practice in 1985? Can you throw some light on that? What was going through in your mind?
Thank you very much, Mohamed and Noreen, for that wonderful introduction. I think much more than I deserve. Nevertheless, as Mohamed points out, I think I've been more than fortunate in that in my life I've had events taking place quite serendipitously and come in contact with people whose influence has directed my life and my work in many different ways. And as Mohamed mentioned, when I was a medical student, as a senior medical student, I found myself traveling in Europe, in Sweden, in Norway, in UK, and in other parts of Europe. I was quite amazed at the distressing realities of where the Western medicine was to where I was being trained and brought up, which was in Uganda. I was born in Kenya, but I went to school in, at that time, considered one of the most prestigious medical schools in Africa, the Makerere University in Kampala. And when I came back, I think things had changed in my perspective of health and medicine and medical education to some degree. And as Mohamed points out, later in my life, after I did my further training in the UK and in Canada, and settled down to what some might call was a very lucrative practice in Calgary at the foothills of Rocky Mountains. The gentleman referred, Shams Qasim Laka, came into my office. And Shams was at that time the chairman of what was then called Owners Representative Board of the Aga Khan University Medical School. And it so happened that it was a very fortuitous encounter that he invited me to visit construction of the new University Medical College that was taking place in Karachi. Now I knew of this place because I had been to Paris and to France, Aix-les-Mots, where I was introduced to this idea of a new medical college coming up, although I wasn't quite sure why, in that part of the world and at that time. But when I visited Karachi on an informal visit, I got to see the glaring degree of human settlements, human suffering, human illnesses, and the very ambitious plans that the Aga Khan University had in trying to tackle that degree of pain and suffering in a way that healthcare was the main focus of the university at that time. It has broadened itself quite a lot since then. So when I came back to Canada, I was very gratified that I was offered a position to take a role as a director of the Community Health Center at the Aga Khan University Hospital. It was a very large university hospital, very sophisticated. And when I joined the university as the director of medical of the Community Health Center, which was a kind of a gateway between the outside community and the inner functioning of a university hospital, which is always a very complex organism. What I began to see here was that there is a need to redirect energies and systems in education in a way that was more relevant and more contextual to the problems that the country was facing. But not only the country, but by extension different parts of the world which had similar backgrounds to Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, many parts of Africa, and in Southeast Asia and so forth. That is how I began to be associated with the Aga Khan University in that instance. And the more I learned about it, the more I learned about the impetus of these universities and the inspiration that it had provided me, the more determined I was to try and make whatever contribution that I could make in moving forward the ambitious plans that the university and the founder of the university had. And that is where I got drawn more and more over the years.
Azim, so 1985, you decided to leave Canada to go to Pakistan. What went on in your mind at the time? What were your thoughts? What were the 2 or 3 things you began to see, what I would call low-hanging fruit, that you thought that you could start making a change on? You arrived in 1985 in Karachi. What did you see there?
Well, at that time, the university was very young, and the programs were nascent. They were just beginning to gel, and therefore there was a lot of opportunity to realize that there was things to be done, that you were given the freedom. I was particularly fortunate in that I was allowed a great deal of latitude in trying to move the one unit that I was working with. But that unit was designed deliberately to serve as an interface between the university hospital with its advanced technologies and specialists and the community outside. But what I saw was that the university was planned in a very thoughtful manner over 12 or 15 years. It was not a new enterprise in terms of its planning and its vision. It was very detailed work. Harvard University was involved, McGill University in Canada was involved, McMaster University in Canada was involved, and a great deal of planning had taken place. But what I found when I took charge of this unit was that what we were seeing was very different from what the planners perhaps had expected, and quite rightly, because the reality was that we were beginning to see, and what I was beginning to see, was that when people came to the university hospital, this was a grand-looking structure, quite unusual for that part of the world, that you would not easily walk into a clinic like that, into a hospital like that. It's like for an average person on the street here, walking into a Harley Street doctor and saying, well, I have a cold or something. You don't do that. So what we were seeing was people who came in who really had tried their best to obtain some kind of care outside the university hospital and had failed to find relief for their problems. So what we were seeing were people who were very sick, people who were desperate, in other words, to look for last resort care. But that also meant going to an institution like the Aga Khan University, which by appearance at least would be frightening for an average person off the street. To say, well, I brought my child or my mother. And I can recall very clearly one example, which I think was an awakening call for me, that in fairly early in my time at the hospital, as the director of the university clinic, one day I remember seeing one of my resident medical officers, a young woman, Dr. D'Souza, wonderful lady, very committed, trained locally, and called me to her office and said, would you mind helping me with this case? And I said, sure. I came in and I saw a gentleman, probably in his late 30s, looking haggard, tired, accompanied by his wife, and there was about an 8 or 9-year-old boy with them. And there was a lady with them, probably in her late 60s. And Renee D'Souza told me that this family have come from near Hyderabad, which is another city quite far out from Karachi. And that they have come, they made a trip because the boy, who was 80-year-old, is very ill. He's been losing weight, has fevers at night, and they have tried local treatments. They have seen hakims and they have seen local practitioners, all they could afford at the time. And at the same time, the mother was also in a great deal of pain, suffering, wasn't eating, was losing weight. So this gentleman was quite tense and worried. How am I going to look after two of my loved ones all at the same time? And I examined the patients, both of them, and soon we were able to make a clear diagnosis that the boy suffered from a chronic intestinal infection. It was beginning to involve his liver, and he was obviously missing school. And the gentleman, the father, when I asked him what he did, he said he sold fruit on a side street. And his wife worked as a cleaner in a small village nearby. So that was the level of income. And he had two other children at home, or three other children at home. He was missing time from work to look after his children and his family. And they had made a very expensive and arduous journey to Karachi to seek treatment for the two people he loved very dearly. So it was evident to me that here we had a case where he was quite sure he would have to make a decision between which of the two he would have to choose to be able to pay for their treatment. And that deeply touched me, because it was evident to me that probably both of these cases could have been treated and diagnosed earlier, could have been treated quite adequately if the right skills and the right knowledge and the right treatments were applied in an early stage. So this man, Abdul Qadir, his name, I recall, was saying that, doctor, I really can't afford treatment of both of these. How much will it cost me? And I said, well, look, we will look after your parent, your child, we will look after your mother. And the mother turned out to have chronic inflammatory disease, probably cancer, which had spread to the spine and part of the bones. She was in real severe pain. And so we through the patient welfare program, we were able to support his care. And he had to pay a very small sum for what he could afford, and we took care of the rest of the costs of his treatment. He was very gratified, but what he brought home to me in a very striking way, well, this is a reality outside. This is the world that we live in. That there is no National Health Service, there is no safety net, there is no support systems, and that an individual at that level, and this means everybody, a population of 200 to 220 million people in Pakistan, a large majority of whom could not afford proper medical care. And even if they could, it wasn't always available. So the first thing that struck me was that we need to make sure that somehow we extend our care, not wait for people to come in through our door, to the portal, where we could then apply our treatment modalities. So that led me to my first recognition that we were seeing very sick people, very poor people, those with very modest means of support, and where life and death situations often meant choosing between eating, treating, choosing between your loved ones. And that's not a pleasant reality.
How did you move? How did the university move to be able to change the entrenched positions that people had taken? Because you can't just come in with a vision and say, I'll change things overnight. What were the approaches that the university had to take to be able to change the culture around which it wanted to develop a vision?
Vision was very clear, and that was that it has to be relevant, impactful, and to extend its knowledge and its technologies to the greatest good of the greatest number of people. In other words, it had to find ways in which to reach out where the people were. So the first thing that the university did, and it was guided very clearly by the vision and the vision statements of the university, that it was meant to be a center of excellence, yes. A center of education, yes. But at the same time, its ultimate mission was to help the population who surrounded it. And therefore, I found that there were several defects or maybe deficiencies in the system. One was that we recognized that the public medical practice or healthcare practices were very inefficient, inadequate to meet the vast needs of people. Now, we were in no position as Aga Khan University or a larger network to be able to change all that. But we had to make a move, we had to make a start somehow, small changes, small programs to begin to change that calculus. And one of the things I recognized was that both our own resident medical officers, who were junior doctors trained in Pakistan and had obtained a very traditional medical education, but they were not in the position to be able to offer high-level clinical care. So we needed to retrain many of those. Secondly, that retraining must not stop within our own doctors in our own framework. We had to reach outside to try and train doctors and health practitioners outside the university. And I think that was the biggest move that we made at the time, and that was to extend our educational facilities to outside practitioners. Because we recognized very quickly, in a period of a year and a half, we recognized that there were practitioners who were not in a position to continue their education, to continue to update their knowledge, to continue to have recourse to advanced learning technologies or treatment science and science-based treatment protocols. So the one thing that I was fortunate in taking a lead in was to establish what we call a continuing medical education programs. And that, and I can tell you, the very first time we did that, we were quite unsure how to go about doing it. Here is a city of Karachi, a city of 20 million people. How are we going to find these practitioners? How are we going to find and say, look, we want to work with you, we want to help you do better for your patients. Tell us how. And we tried doing that. Some of the people in the university and the people who worked with me went out and reached out to as many practitioners as they could, personally going and handing out and saying, well, we are prepared to hold some refresher courses for you and to help you so that you can help your patients. And we had thought that maybe at the first round, if you can get about 50 people to come in to attend our seminars, we would be doing very well. Well, as it was, we had 380 applications, and we could only take in about 100, but we managed to squeeze in 180 learners on that first venture. And it was such a heartwarming enterprise, I think, that people were saying that no one in the past has made this effort. The established universities and medical colleges or anyone else, or the government or any other societies or associations had made that effort to bring them in contact with continuing professional development and continuing education, as the Aga Khan University was making this effort. And we made it very problem-based. We looked at common problems like tuberculosis, weight loss, anemia, malaria, children's problems, women's pregnancy issues, whole work. There was no end to how much knowledge had to be shared. So we did about a 2-week course, 2 or 3 times a week, several hours, and the university's faculty were delighted to take part in it. With the result that this became one of the pillars of the university's efforts in retraining and making a difference in the larger world outside. And in fact, I'm pleased to say that soon after our first effort, His Highness the Aga Khan was visiting the university with the Board of Trustees meeting, and he was absolutely delighted that this is what the vision that he has in his mind, that the university is not an entity, a closed entity in its own self, but it is a resource for wider good. And we had to be creative in how we use that resource of the university to reach out as widely and as economically as possible to share our knowledge and to share our continuing facilities. And that's how we started, and that program today still exists. Maybe I left, I was there almost 40 years ago. So even today, it's one of the most popular things that the university does. We had undergraduate medical education, we had postgraduate medical education, but we did not have continuing professional development for outside doctors and health practitioners who were starved of knowledge, starving for facilities to upgrade them. And this was the first time that a major effort was done by any in the university in this manner.
Azim, the problems you're mentioning, one normally associates with a different part of the world. Today, living in the West, we're beginning to see a lot of these problems at our doorstep. You've practiced in Canada, we live in Europe. Is this something now that you think it's out there, or is it very much over here? What's the problem as you see today? Because you spoke at the St. George's about 2-3 weeks ago, and Professor Julian Ma said, this could be our problem. Our curriculum doesn't allow our students to go anywhere outside, very narrow focus. How do they get to know about things out there? How do they get to know about things out here that we're not aware of? What do you see the major problem of healthcare today globally, of which the developing world's work is one dimension? Is our governments taking this seriously? Have they outsourced it? Is this being done by private medicine? What are the problems as you see?
Well, it's a very complex question because it has many parts to it. If I address initially that there is no part of the world which you can say has a satisfactory health care system, none. And COVID pandemic has laid bare the deficits, the deficiencies in every part of the world, in every healthcare system, in advanced and rich countries to the economically low-end countries. So there is no part of the world which has not been exposed as having weak healthcare systems, number one. Number two, I think by tradition, medical education and healthcare education has been devolved from the governments. They have more or less handed it out to individual universities and institutions and to design their programs and their education as they see fit. And I think what has happened, and this has been my principal concern in the recent years, is that medicine has drifted to a degree that it has become so tiny focused that practitioners today are taught more and more about less and less. In other words, you have super specialized knowledge being given, which becomes, that means the practitioners have a very narrow view. And when, as you mentioned, Professor Julian Ma, when he invited me to speak, and I said, well, you are a very high-end research institute, and I have nothing to offer you in terms that you are at the molecular level of technologies, and I'm talking in broad terms about health and development. He said, yes, that's precisely the reason, because when we look at what we do, we tend to forget that there is a human being behind all this, that there is a population behind it, that there is suffering behind this. We tend to get so attached to that one molecule that we are working with, or one organism, or one idea, or one chemical, that we tend to forget what is its ultimate use. And what you bring in is an alternative reality to us, and we need to know this, our students need to know this. And therefore, it is not a problem confined to any part of the world. Every health system in the world, and I have seen many, many in different parts of the world, there are deficits in planning, there are deficits in tradition, and medical education, like healthcare systems in general, have been built piecemeal over time. Many have simultaneous private medicine and public health systems running side by side. I mean, your Britain is a classical example when you had a world-class National Health Services in 1948 when it was introduced here at the end of the Second World War. That was a model. It was a classic model that everybody has access to equal and fair treatment no matter what your ability to pay was. Before that, the history of British medicine was terrible. I referred to it in my book. And everything was for themselves. Those who could afford to pay could get any care. Those who could not would not have anything. Nobody cared. So that was a government initiative. And people fought very hard for it. Some, those who cared, those who understood that the wider social and economic development of any country dependent on healthy populations. And so when National Health Service came into Britain, and then other countries in Scandinavia and Europe and others followed, like in Canada, over time this became diluted, as I see it, more and more because the governments devolved some of their responsibility to private sector. And the private sector is by nature a profit-seeking service, by and large, whether it's medicine or healthcare, which is a human right, in my opinion, and I bet most of you agree with that. even that is sold to the highest bidder. In other words, you can, if you can afford it, you can get finest care, even more than you need, most likely. But nevertheless, if you can't afford it, you get second-rate care. Or you don't get any care at all in countries like in India, large parts of India, or Pakistan, or Bangladesh, or many other countries. So, to divide healthcare based on an economic possibility, an economic ability to care is essentially, in this day and age, I think is morally and ethically unacceptable. And there are people who begin to feel like what I'm saying, and I'm not the only one. In fact, I have learned this passion from others who have been through the cycle and have seen the suffering and the neglect and the marginalization of people who simply have no means of supporting themselves, either with food or medicine, if and when it's even available. And if it's available, what is its quality? What is its nature? Is it appropriate? Is it timely? Is it effective? Is it efficient? These were not things which governments get involved in very often. And I regret to say that this is countries like the United States and increasingly countries like Canada and parts of Europe, and unsettling as it may seem. Even in developing countries, when I say developing countries, I mean high transition, rapidly transition countries like Brazil, India, and others, private medicine is taken a far greater center stage as care providers than the public health systems. The government simply doesn't spend enough. Maybe 1% of its GDP, when they spend gladly 40 or 50% on arms and military spending. So there is such a growing imbalance between the basic dignity of human right and human suffering versus what they consider is a modern reality for a nation, for a country, in which that you have to be secure, you have to be prominent, you have to be industrially advanced, and that means you have to have a posture. And you see that around us today. Military posturism, nationalism, populism, these are the words of the day. This is what drives government policy. Neoliberalism has taken a very strong front over the last decade or two. And it affects everything. Healthcare more than anything else. And what I'm trying to say is health is a very complex phenomenon. You can't talk about health. In fact, I should start by really saying that the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not simply the absence of disease or infirmity. Now, when you look at it that way, everything that happens in any community, any society, and in any nation impacts health. So health is a result of a whole myriad of factors. It's not simply somebody having a disease or not, or having a drug or not, or a chemical or not, or a technology or not. That's not the idea. When you look at health on a global scale, or you look at it on a population scale, everything that happens around you, the environment you live in, the housing, the nutrition, the food, the quality of life, all of these impact health. And therefore, no institution can target this individually. This is a question of multi-sectoral input, which only the governments can do. And not only individual governments, but internationally collaborations are required in this. This is where the world has drifted, I think, in the last 20 or 30 years, to such a fragmented state. In every possible way, whether you look within the country or you look outside the country, there is increasing fragmentation, increasing less cooperation, and less sharing of knowledge and the best practices with each other. And I think, as you said, Mohamed, the Western world is probably in a worse state than the developing world. The developing countries and the low-income countries have the possibility, given the right conditions, of not making the mistakes which the West has made. And that is that you do not allow complete and total fragmentation of social policies and social responsibility. Once you allow that and you say, well, private sector will take care of it, then you are actually selling your soul, in a sense. So it's a very powerful thing that we are seeing in the world today. And I fear that most people at higher levels do not see that, do not recognize the dangers in this. Bodies like United Nations, World Health Organization, and I've been asked this question, do they have any relevance? Well, that's the only thing we have left, which are multilateral, which have to tend to take a broader socio-economic view, and by social view, health falls under that they tend to try and balance at least. But, you know, riven with, as we are, with political divisions within the geopolitical arena that we have, that even bodies like UN, WHO are restrained in their ability to act as well as they should be. I think it's a very frightening prospect. And the more I see, and I practice in Canada, I teach in Canada, although I travel greatly to other parts of the world, to me, that is becoming more and more evident wherever I go. I mean, I was recently in India, and I visited some of the teaching hospitals where I was invited, and I see the most up-to-date standards of technology, and most up-to-date, well-trained specialists. But then I went into the rural areas of India, in Gujarat, in other parts, in Punjab, and I was shocked at the absolute bare conditions under which healthcare is provided. In a crisis like COVID-19 laid that utterly bare, people were simply shoved on the side as pieces of refuge. And I think it's staggering that those countries which try and catch up with the Western model of development sometimes forget their social responsibilities. So who is there to rein them in? I don't know. I really don't know. All I can say is that there are institutions like the Aga Khan Development Network, for instance, with whom I'm fairly acquainted, who try and set models, examples of multi-sectoral development in which you look at populations, you look at limited populations, or in parts of geographical parts of a country, and say that, well, health cannot occur without housing. Housing cannot occur without education, or with economic development, or with environmental improvement. These have to go side by side. You cannot be uni-sectoral today. You cannot act in silos anymore. And that multi-sectoriality is absolutely critical. And there are very few agencies or bodies which are actually interested in this. Even government policies are very divided. You have policy for this, you have policy for that, you have policy for this. But there is no horizontal integration of these silo-like vertical programs.
But what are the things that you champion that today give you a sense of inner comfort, that you were able to put one or two things into practice in trying to address some of the problems you saw? Is there anything that comes to your mind to say, I'm quite happy that I did one or two things, maybe I didn't do enough, but these are things I thought?
First thing I would say is that I'm pleased that the initiative of continuing medical education, continuing professional development, and opening the doors of the university to much wider educational possibilities is something that I'm very happy with. I was not alone, obviously. There were people who backed me and who supported me. And that has become a very strong program. It's now so widespread that we have it across about 20 different countries. And I personally have seen a lot of the progress in continuing professional development. But it's not only the medical knowledge or the clinical knowledge or the advances in medicine that are shared. What is shared is values as well. What is shared is ethics as well. What is shared is real life situations which are dealt. So that is one area. Second thing I would say at least a small role that I played in it, was to try and reorient medical education in such a way that wherever I had the possibility, was to recognize that the science of medicine can become very narrow and very constricting. And if you do not underpin that science and knowledge with a greater understanding of the humanities, of the art of medicine, of the ethics of medicine, and of dignity of individuals and of human beings, then no matter what level of scientific knowledge you have, you cannot be effective. So that is the other area that I pushed very hard in blending or interdigitating medical education in a more broader way. And finally, I would say that a lot of my efforts were spent in building networks, in collaborations and in corporations, both regionally and internationally. So within Pakistan or in India or in East Africa and South Africa and in many parts of the world, I was fortunate in getting the opportunity to build networks which were greatly supportive of each other. So if there are different colleges of physicians or health practitioners or other types, they could see the advances in learning from each other. That's one thing. Secondly, sharing resources. And I was very fortunate in having opportunity to build these networks with much larger Western advanced universities in the United States and Europe. And there are places in the Western world who are very keen to participate in development of the low-income countries.
In an elevator speech in about 3 minutes or less, what is the essence of your book? I mean, you're talking about your life, you've been to different countries, you've worked as a ship doctor on a launch, you've been looking at the Mujahideen in Peshawar, you've been gone into a little village in Morocco to look at a child who was very ill, you've done this in Thailand. What in essence is your book actually saying to any young medical professional today going into medical school?
Well, I would certainly not advise people to follow my pathway blindly because it is very expensive and it's very destructive. But nevertheless, you grow. And I think what the essence of what I've been trying to say is that we live in a very interconnected world, and the world sometimes doesn't realize this. The pain in one part of the world, as His Highness says, is very soon felt in other parts of the world before long. We live in a world where there is so much information, but not wisdom. I feel that the wisdom is lacking. And I feel that an overarching philosophical or an ethical or a moral perspective on human development, and human development as a factor, health being one part of it, is lacking. And there is no body of any particular kind, no government and no organization which seems keenly focused on saying, we need to bring all these strands together. We need a framework to understand what is human health. I mean, we're talking today about planetary health. And planetary health is crucial for human health. And yet they're divided into different areas. Planetary scientists who are trying their best to bring to the world's consciousness that the world is going to the pots. I mean, the climate crisis is a far bigger deal than people make of it. It is a big deal. But the same thing is happening in that so much suffering unnecessarily is still taking place. And it does not require massive injection of cash to be able to solve those problems. I think what is required is a determination and a broad understanding, first and foremost, of a humanistic, common humanity. Everybody is interconnected. First of all, you cannot divorce and say, well, I'm this or I'm that or I'm white or I'm black or I'm red and I live in the north and you live in the south, I think those divisions are gone forever. Because nobody can escape the consequences of everything that is taking place around them. Whether you take it, the security position in Europe today, or you take the health crisis taking place in Kenya. I mean, yesterday I was seeing it, it was heartbreaking to see that in parts of northern Kenya, in parts of Somalia, in Ethiopia, that people literally have to get rid of their last cattle or cow or chicken or goat or whatever it is, starvation, because there has been an enormous famine and drought in that region. A drought which we understand, know that the climate crisis had a lot to do with. But these are not the people who contributed to that climate crisis, but they are paying the price. And yet the world does not tend to look at the world at large, to look at one common family of human beings and one common service, which is to have equal rights, human rights, basic human dignity. This is lacking from any kind of discourse that I know of. And I think this is what has to be pushed in front of the global agendas of development. And by development, I mean development all over the world. There is no part of the world which does not need development. And the developing countries have a lot to teach the advanced countries. Finding local solutions in a small way, naturally, what we really need is finding local solutions to local problems. And people have the wisdom to do it. They need simple technologies, they need some simple funding. And the one thing research has shown very clearly that would make the greatest impact on global health is universal health care. Universal health care. By that we mean, and there was a research study by Lancet Commission. To give you a little background, in 1993, the World Bank produced a report called Investing in Health. And then 20 years later, the Lancet, the very famous medical journal, produced a commission to say, well, what progress has been made and what can we do in the future? And they showed clearly that any investment in a universal health care around the world, in every part, would produce 9 to 20 times the benefit economically of what you invest in one generation. So the answers are there. The willpower, the will to carry out this in bold initiatives is lacking because there is no body which is charged with this responsibility. There is no body which is charged with saying that we need to make human suffering, assuage human suffering around the world, because it is within our capability to do so. The world has enough resources to do that very, very easily. To eliminate malaria, for instance, would take today 1/4 cost of one nuclear submarine to totally eliminate malaria, which kills 400,000 people a year. 250 million people suffer from it. Same with tuberculosis. Same with other conditions like schistosomiasis, bilharzia, and so on. So there are many conditions which can be targeted, easily fixed, if there was determination, if there was cooperation, if there was a global vision towards one end.
Thank you very much for the very enlightening sharing of your experience and your vision, what you've done. And it's nice to see how you still carry on fighting the corner of the primary care in the secondary care, which is always been very difficult. And long may that carry on, and I'm sure you speak on the right ears and knocking the right doors to bring that, to remind people that the primary care is the main providers and secondary care is there to support.
Absolutely.
And we found that the critical factors, even before going into hospital or healthcare, are literacy. So in Pakistan's case, it will be definitely female literacy.
Yes.
Access to clean water.
Yes.
care in maternal
Yes.
work and
Yeah.
so on. And we found that if you compare, for example, India, Iran and Turkey,
Right.
you'll find that Iran is ahead of both those.
Yes.
Life expectancy,
Yes. Yes.
infant mortality,
Yes.
access to clean water,
Yes.
female literacy,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore the healthcare needs overall
Yeah.
are minimized. If what you are doing is admirable,
Yeah.
but it is such a big problem if you don't
Yes.
address that.
Correct.
And I think in Pakistan, especially, if you don't
Yes.
address literacy, you are not going to make headway.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think what you pointed out is that there are three things which I think are most interconnected and impact health. One is education, and by that even basic literacy. It's been shown experimentally that even basic literacy in women make them economically much more productive, and therefore the families benefit and the communities benefit. They become socially more productive. The second thing, as you said, is basic environmental sanitation. I mean, we still suffer. 1 billion people out of the 8 billion people on the planet today have difficulty in accessing decent supply of water or food, food security, clean drinking water. These are classic interventions which should be focused like a laser beam, because these can make an enormous difference to the end. The third thing is integrating primary care with secondary care and tertiary care. By tradition and by common usage, I think people are used to seeing medicine as you go with an illness to a doctor. I've got chest pain, I've got the stomach pain, and the doctor analyzes and treats you. And so it's one person at a time, one thing at a time. That's never going to be enough in many parts of the world. You need to get to the fundamental causes, and some of the causes you pointed out are very true. So poverty, illiteracy, and basic sanitation, I would say, are critical. So when we talk about primary health care, that was tried, as you know, in Alma-Ata Declaration of 1978, which was probably the greatest social declaration of this generation, or rather of present current times, where the underlying message was social justice for all, essentially, by primary care as being the primary. But that didn't work out. Because people wanted immediate access to the advanced cares right away. You know, I got a headache, I must have a CT scan. And if I don't see a neurologist, then I'm going to die. So that kind of attitude, I think, drove the world of private care, and obviously the private pharmaceutical companies and all of those loved that nature. So to do the greatest good to the greatest numbers, you still have to build a system step by step, primary, then secondary, then tertiary, but in a graded way. The Afghan University in the network is trying to do this, but it would be a model, really speaking. It'd just be a small model. And it's never easy. It's been very, very difficult to do that, particularly when you're working in an environment which is not conducive to such a thing. And to keep the costs modest, moderate, so that it is affordable, otherwise it's really an ivory tower. So you need to keep it modest and moderate, this first thing. And some of the things that I was involved in, for instance, in Africa, was to try and get even basic drugs. The WHO has got an essential drugs guideline, as I'm sure you're aware. And this guideline indicates what are the basic drugs that every country must have. And yet most hospitals, when you go to India or Pakistan or anywhere else, they will have every fancy drug, but they will not have the simple ones. The ones which cost you about 3 cents, they will not have, but $300 they will have. And I mentioned an example or two in the book where, people have had to literally sell their farm, their livelihood to pay for one treatment with an expensive drug which was unnecessary, and it destroyed families' futures forever. So I think the humanistic, the compassion, the care where is it going to come from? If we left entirely to the private sector and for profit-seeking sector, we are never going to get there. So somebody needs to step in and say, you know, there has to be a mechanism in which everybody is entitled to some basic care, and which is affordable and which is contextual and which is relevant to them. This is where the system is broken down, in my view.
How do we incentivize the corporate world which teaches greed is good, you know, which is bottom line driven? And if it is not the pennies and pounds, what can incentivize these people? Government is not putting in the money, public sector is not putting in the money. The private sector is looking for that philosopher's stone, that one molecule, one antibiotic, which would get them trillions of dollars of profit, whoever invents that first. If they don't do it for the money, what can incentivize them? How do we convince them to do this, but not for the money?
When we were in Africa, we used to use a drug, a simple anti-malarial drug, which at that time cost less than 5 cents US, 4 or 5 cents. And when this company bought over their drug, the manufacturer, they jacked up the cost of their drug to about $200, okay? To such a degree that ultimately the CEO who did that had to answer to some kind of a panel which criticized him so much he had to leave his position and he lost. But from 4 cents to $200 US, because the drug was then found to be useful for another condition, which was more of a problem in the Western world, in the United States, than as an anti-malarial in Africa. And this drug obviously became completely unavailable in Africa, totally. People who had used this to treat, the doctors who were using this to treat malaria could no longer have it. So where is the incentive to motivate people to do good with their industrial complex rather than harm? I have constantly thought about this. This keeps me awake. I think what is happening is that people like Bill Gates, for instance, the Bill Gates Foundation and others have done enormous work into trying to bring about some sanity in the industrial world. But they are far and few between, because by and large, the growth of a country or a nation is measured in economic terms only. Only economic, this is it. 5% growth, 3% growth, this and so. Nobody measures how happy your people are, how satisfied they are, how healthy they are, or you know, how many times in a month do they laugh. So I think that there is something much more fundamental that needs to be awakened in people's consciousness. And I'm not quite sure. I do think that some of the younger leaders and entrepreneurs are coming up with that. I have done some programs at Harvard where they're starting a course, this particular course in the Harvard Business Journal has published a decent volume of articles that they did about training their executives in their MBA programs to learn basic humanities, compassion, humanity, nature of collective life, history. These are things which were never taught in universities before. So some of the younger and newer executives are being given this knowledge now. Few universities are doing it, not many, but I suspect this will spread. And I think, not me so much, but there are many others who have spoken much more powerfully that we need a sane world. We need a sane world. We are insane right now. That we need some sanity, but that sanity has to find not only champions, but has to grow from within. And really speaking, religion now is frowned upon. People talk about humanism in different ways. Yet, in the book I mentioned that even Aristotle mentions the Nicomachean Ethics when he wrote 2,500 years ago, that this is ultimately what nature intends for human life, to live by virtue. How do you teach virtue when the world has drifted so far apart? How do you take them back and say, look, virtue is more important, compassion is more important, humanity is more important than material wealth? You know, people are so attached to materialism. And the degree of hedonism and narcissism that exists in the world that you see around you sometimes is saddening. So the world is becoming divided, unfortunately. I do believe, I am optimistic enough to think that this will change. And I think COVID has been an eye-opener in many ways to many people, that there is some value in being as a family together rather than as divided nations.
A lot of these ideas about social determinants of health and treating the human being and primary care, all of these were very clearly outlined. And so the answer is kind of easy and obvious. And the problem seems to be maybe the political economy of how to get there. And I wonder if from some of the things you mentioned about when you went to Karachi and you started to make changes, it wasn't that the answer was difficult, but maybe how to convince people, how to get the incentives right, how to...
That's right.
That seems to be the big challenge, you know. And now it seems that the international development community has abandoned those principles and come with universal health coverage, by which they mean access to tertiary care through the private sector, providing government funding to people to
absolutely right.
So how do we reverse that, and maybe you can share some ideas?
Any of your physicians here who practice medicine know that anxiety is something that every patient who walks into your office brings with him or her. So anxiety in many different forms is pervasive. The wars are fought over anxiety, tensions. Anxiety is pervasive, and it leads to distrust, and it leads to tensions. Countering that is hope. If hope could be reinvigorated somehow in people's hearts and in their minds and in their lives, then that hope keeps the light of future alive. And so I think you pointed out to a very important point. Coming to your point, you know, when the Alma-Ata Declaration was made, all the countries signed on it. 1977, in the 30th World Health Assembly, they all said, oh, this is perfect, this is exactly what the world needs. When it came time to implementing any of the parameters of the Alma-Ata Declaration, Health for All, everybody backed off, because what it involved was changing their institutions, their education institutions, their social institutions, their political institutions. Those needed to be shattered and reconstructed, which nobody wanted to do, because these were their comfort areas, these were their power bases. Nobody wanted to shatter all that and recreate another thing in which there was justice and equity for all. That is why the primary care movement from Alma-Ata time did not gel. And today, as you say, we have gone to the other extreme. Everything is privatized. Well, somebody will solve it. Let them make some money out of it, and we'll have enough people covered to take care of their medical needs. So there is no constructive, I think, dialogue coming out from national levels, by and large, and I'm very disappointed in Britain in particular, because they set the original plans of equitable care. You look at countries like Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, Holland. These were countries with very strong national health systems, but they are also loosening. So I think we are going to see a more difficult, turbulent period before we begin to see some sanity coming back. I wish we could commodify love, sell it. That would solve the problem. But what we might commodify, I think, is awakening of a sense of morality, a common human morality. We all have it within us. You see, compassion, you can't teach compassion in universities and medical schools. You can't teach humanism in a proper sense. I mean, some schools like Harvard and others try. But what is the one thing? There is, in my view, there is no simple one bullet. But what His Highness the Aga Khan has said very often is that balance between the material and the spiritual. The spiritual is not a clean word in the Western lexicon anymore. You can't use that kind of language anymore because people will say you're a Bible thumping something or the other. And it's a pity because when people drift away from these simple value systems which underpinned life in the past, family life, community life, social life, recognizing the value of each other, common dignity, common decency, that seems to be vanishing. If you look below that, which is what I'm trying to do, to maintain some degree of optimism that the world has a future, is to say that there is an awakening, I think at a deeper level. People are understanding that there is global suffering and we are all in it together. That we have to try and find the right balance. However, there is no forum that I know of which speaks up. What we need really is a moral rearmament of the world. How do you morally rearm the world? I mean, we are arming with nuclear weapons and everything else. But where do you get moral rearmament? What is the ethic behind it? What is the force that we could use? And I would have thought about it. I really don't know the answer. But I think ultimately the pain and suffering globally will become intense enough that people will want to sit back and say, how do we bring some validity, some happiness in our lives? Right? Money is not the matter. Materially, it's not going to buy you that. And I think it's a painful realization. And until the world comes to that crisis level, and we are close to that, I don't think there will be a moral reawakening taking place. The faith of Islam and that I will practice enjoins values of compassion, generosity, sharing, and these are values you don't talk about in medical school anymore. You don't talk about in any social courses, really speaking. How do you bring it back in? I have tried in a very small way in my own students. People have loved it, people have enjoyed it, and in private conversations they've said, nobody, even when I teach here at the University of British Columbia, my students have told me that no other professor has taught us in the way that you do, because you make us describe the person as a human being. Not that, well, this person is coming with high blood pressure or heart disease or failing liver or something. You look at a person and say, this is a 30-year-old man who works in this, he's had this kind of history and this is it, and he's coming with this jaundice or whatever it is. And so you're looking at it more holistically. How do you bring that holism back into practice of medicine, as well as in social policy, as in global policy and global interactions?
I would just like to highlight His Highness's efforts in establishing internal and external institutions. Internal institutions in 21 countries, which links very closely health, education, economic, embodied within ethics and values. And all the external organizations, AKDN, in numerous countries. Do you see that making an impact in the future?
The good thing about AKDN, and Azim himself has said that we have many levers that we can push. Sometimes we choose to use one lever more than the other. It may be health, maybe education, maybe housing, maybe environment, maybe economic empowerment, maybe women's. So we do have in different conditions and different times and different places levers that we can use. But essentially the idea is that you combine the efforts and energies of different sectors to work together on global development essentially. But these are still small scale projects, and they will remain small scale because we are a small community and we have although the network is large, it is still relatively by world needs is very small. So what we're really doing is establishing models, prototypes. And once these are shown to be successful, then I think they will diffuse out into the outer world.